Imagine John Wick, only instead of getting revenge for losing his puppy, John Wick is angry because his entire family is frozen to death. And he's mad because the people who allowed his family to freeze to death are English. And it's 1847, and he's in Ireland, and they're in the middle of the Irish Potato Famine. Ladies and gentlemen, I just gave to you Black 47. Guys, if you haven't seen Black 47, we watched it on the watch party a few years ago. It came out in 2018. It's an Irish production film about life during the Irish Potato Famine, and it is a roller coaster of a ride, and it's a lot of fun, and it's got some sneaky history in there too. Hey, everybody, welcome to Historians of the Movies podcast. I am your host and creator, Jason Herbert, and every single week we are talking about movies and the histories behind them. And this week, we're talking about Black 47. We're also talking about the history of the Irish Potato Famine itself with my friend Padraic Scanlan. He wrote a brand new book called Rot, an Imperial History of the Irish Famine. And it's a perfect time for us to be talking about Ireland and Irish history. It's certainly just past St. Patrick's Day here in the United States. But more importantly, there's a huge diaspora of people with Irish descent, both in the United States and in Canada, where Padraic is both from, and also where most of us will be moving within the next couple of years. So today's conversation is about Black 47. If you haven't had a chance to watch it yet, absolutely go and do. You can find it pretty easily on streaming right now. And we're going to talk about this book. We're going to talk about the Irish famine. We're going to talk about the misconceptions behind it, and also the role of the famine that plays in memory, both for people in Ireland today and also people of Irish descent in the United States, Canada, and elsewhere. This is a really fun conversation about a really brutal film. So I hope you enjoy it, guys. Sit back and relax. Black 47 is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. All right, you ready to rock?
Let's do it.
Padraic, dude, I am so excited to talk to you today. You wrote a book. I
did. Oh, look, you actually have it. I've not seen it yet. Very cool.
Are you serious? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I have it right here in my hands. Very nice.
Yeah, you know what? So I was Megan Roberts over at Basic. I'll give her a shout out because she's amazing. Sent me a copy of this. I get the advanced reader copies.
I haven't seen any of the. I haven't seen either the UK or the North American edition yet.
Here you go.
Looks good. Looks more persuasive in print.
I've read it, my friend.
Very nice.
I've read this book and I love it. It's so good. In fact, I was saying yesterday, I was like, America's in such a dark place right now. I'm going to read something more uplifting, like an Imperial History of the Irish Famine. But, I feel like this is so important to talk about, at least for like the American audiences here in the U.S. That might be listening to this pod who are maybe broadly familiar with the famine, but really don't know the ins and outs. And that was certainly my case. This is the first book I've ever read on the famine. And for me, it was like, oh, okay, I get this. And a lot of the stuff that you're talking about here about processes of colonialism, identity, othering, like we're just talking about, are so important. And frankly, I think really relevant all the way to like right now. So I'm excited to talk about this book. I'm excited to talk about this movie, which I low-key love. Yeah. But let's go. But before we do that, let's talk about you, actually. Do you want to introduce yourself and talk about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. I'm Padraic Scanlan. I'm an associate professor in the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources and the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto. So I'm an historian. I work in two interdisciplinary departments at Toronto, where I am in each one the only historian. So familiar. Before that, I worked for 5 years. I started my career in the UK at the London School of Economics, where I worked in a more conventional history department, and I worked for a long time on the history of British labor, but especially the history of the transition from enslaved to free labor in the Caribbean and of British anti-slavery in Britain itself.
Okay. See, all right. So understanding your background makes so much sense as I reflect on what I read in your book, because so much of this is labor, so much is this class dynamics, and all of the, obviously colonialism. When you talk about the Caribbean and other places, it it starts to square the circle, if you will. I have to ask you though, why you wrote this book, Rot, an Imperial History of the Irish Famine. Why write this book? Like, what was the impetus behind writing this? Why did you feel like I need to write this book and it needs to be written
Yeah.
now?
So, I had finished writing a book for a general audience like this one called Slave Empire, which came out in 2020, and then in paperback a little later. And I was looking, I had initially imagined writing a kind of, I sort of got the bug for writing books for a general audience. There's a lot more kind of instant gratification to it. So I was trying to think about a way to get at one of the things that I'm most interested in British history in general, which is the kind of relationship between the ideology of liberalism and the reality of the kind of experiences, especially of the people who kind of feel most acutely and most directly the impact of liberal policies, especially workers, whether they're enslaved or free. And then, just before and just after the pandemic, my parents died, and my brother, who it's unlike him, but he started doing genealogical research as a kind of like, especially after our dad died, and was because that's the kind of like Irish diasporic side of the family. My mom was French Canadian. And then I started thinking about the famine as a potential project. And initially, I had framed the book as something called Irish Questions. Right, that was what the book was originally titled when I pitched it. And so it was trying to understand the place of Ireland within the British Empire. Initially, was the kind of project, and then the famine became a kind of narrative that would both kind of make the book more interesting to people who might not be as interested in the kind of intricacies of British social policy in the first half of the 19th century. And also, because it seemed to me to, as I started to kind of dig into the sources more, to illuminate a lot of the kinds of questions that I was interested in asking, and the kinds of questions I had asked in stuff about slavery and anti-slavery, about the way that ideas about the kind of racialized ideas, or if not necessarily explicitly racial ideas for the Irish, about the capacity for work and the capacity for civilization and the relationship between civilization and labor and civilization and work discipline. All of those questions were kind of right there in the history of Ireland in this era. And also, I think in Slave Empire, a lot of it was synthetic, but one of the sections of it that was kind of itself from it was originally pitched as a more academic book, and it was supposed to be about apprenticeship in the Caribbean. And that ended up being one chapter in this trade book. That was really the chapter that was most like an academic history book, in the sense that it was based on the kind of deepest engagement with archives that had been unexplored, that kind of thing. And one of the biggest points of comparison in that era between formerly enslaved, recently emancipated laborers in the Caribbean was with Irish laborers who were free and had always been free, at least within the British Empire, but who seemed to be, after recently emancipated, formerly enslaved workers, they seem to be the next step up on the ladder of civilization among imperial subjects. Or at least, I guess maybe, yeah. And so it seemed like there were all of these points of connection. And there were also a lot of Irish military officers on half pay who served in the Caribbean at that time. And so, there was this kind of proximate personal reason to start digging into Ireland, and all of these other bigger kind of intellectual concerns that had been bubbling along in the background.
Well, I mean, first of all, I have to applaud you for taking this to a trade press, for bringing this to basic, because I feel like that's where the lifting is done. Like to do this work, to say, hey, this is cool history, right? This stuff that the book that you read, I find is fascinating, and a lot of the other scholars that we've talked about. Like, I'm afraid, university presses have their places and they're great, but I worry sometimes that we're not reaching larger audiences, and there is a real craft. And I hope, and I feel like this is starting to be dismantled a bit within the academy, because there's always this long thing. It's like, oh, trade presses aren't as academic. It's like, that's complete nonsense. Because when I read your book, I'm like, oh my gosh, I am becoming so much more informed about this. It's great. I love that you did this. I have some questions for you about the famine itself, right? Which is, you start researching this book. You're in the process of doing so. Did you find, Padraic, about, were there popular misconceptions about the famine that you were either were aware of as you headed into the research of this, or became aware of as you were writing the book?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I try to do a couple of times in Rot is to sort of explain the ways that, and actually sort of serendipitously, like the very first reviews of the book came out this morning in the Irish Independent. And they had two reviews, which I found quite flattering. One which was quite negative, and one which was quite positive. Which I mean, is like kind of in a way like shows that the book is having, and both of them framed the book as polemical, which I didn't find, in writing it, I didn't intend it as a polemic.
Okay.
So I guess it says something about the state of the kind of gulf between, I guess, like general histories of the famine and academic history. Anyway, it's neither here nor there. But there are a couple of things that I always had been told as a kid were true about the famine, that are kind of diasporic myths about the famine. And one was the kind of the genocidal character of it, right? The idea that the famine was deliberate, it was planned. There's even a book called The Famine Plot that frames it as, which is both a kind of riff on like the marriage plot and like the kind of implotment of it, but also implies a little bit that the famine, if it wasn't directly, like Britain didn't cause it, but they didn't do anything to stop it. And and maybe this will come through when we talk a little bit about Black 47, right? Like there's a lot to condemn Britain about in its famine, in the history of the Irish famine. But a lack of action is not one of the things, is not really something that you can put at Britain's feet, right? They did a lot of, and one of the argument I'm trying to make in the book is that, or one of the arguments is that one of the things that Britain did was just spend enormous amounts of time and money and energy and personnel doing things to, like, trying to solve the Irish famine with exactly the same kinds of policies that caused the Irish famine. And so it's not like Britain committed genocide or even intended to commit genocide, but that they, that they tried to solve a crisis that British imperial dynamics had created by applying more forcefully and more directly exactly those dynamics. So that was one. Another one that I'm may come up in reviews, is the super myth, right? The idea that, which actually is in Black 47, there's a super scene in Black 47, which was the idea that Protestant missionaries effectively like traded conversion from like a Catholic apostasy for food. And I'm not saying that never happened, in the same way that I'm not saying that there was no instances of like there are rumors of cannibalism in the Irish famine, but there are very few credible examples, if any. And actually the few examples that I list in the book are maybe apocryphal. And I try to show that they may or may not have, it's certainly something that happens in famines, but it's not clear that it happened in the Irish famine. It certainly wasn't widespread. And so it's possible that there were Protestant missionaries who did this quid pro quo. But like in my family, right, there's two ways of spelling Scanlan, right? Scanlan and Scanlon. And there was always this kind of floating myth in my family that the O was like kind of like a scarlet letter. And it marked that, at least in the famine, either you were a Protestant to begin with, or that you had converted, and that like you lost the second A in your name by virtue of being, you know what I mean? And that's not true, right? And so there's these kind of like, but there are all of these legends built up, especially in the diaspora, about the famine that express a kind of like sort of a spiritual or a moral truth about the famine, but don't have that much bearing on the famine itself. And one of the sources I try to use in Rot to get at those is this really spectacular, and like I don't know Irish, right? So I can't read in a way, like if I were a better historian, I would have learned Irish to get at all of these folkloric sources. But in the Irish Free State, shortly after in the 1930s, so just like a couple of decades after, a decade and a bit after independence, it was a kind of public project, really cute public project actually, where Irish school children were asked to like interview old people, their grandparents and other older people, and like record everything. And they had a list of questions, and some of them were about famine. And so I use those it's called the Schools Collection. And I use the Schools Collection of folklore a lot to kind of provide like a kind of like to sort of show the evolution of the folkloric history of the famine at the same time as I'm trying to describe the actual kind of boots on the ground history of the famine. And so a lot of the folkloric, and these were kids who were like school kids in the 1930s, like if they're interviewing people in their 80s, right? These are people who were, if they were alive during the famine, were very young. So a lot of their memories of the famine are just entirely, they're entirely mythic, right? And so you can see the evolution of famine myths like happening in time as the Irish diaspora expands and as the famine retreats into the past. The myth of the famine becomes almost, and it's not wildly different from the famine itself, but there are elements of it that are different. And so I tried to kind of find those instances and not like deflate them, but just kind of show that the way that the diaspora remembers the famine as this kind of moment of profound rupture and the kind of point of origin for the Irish diaspora worldwide, or if not the point of origin, certainly the most important point of origin. That's not necessarily, emigration and exile changed what Ireland was and changed what Irishness was. And that's something that I try to, like, in many ways, like a lot of the stereotypes about Irishness now are diasporic creations, and the stereotypes of what the Irish were like that the British cleaved to in the 1840s were very different from the kinds of stereotypes that are now associated with Irishness. So, I'm trying to and that was actually what one of these reviews this morning said, like, this is a book for North Americans. And it was meant in a kind of like, and in a way, maybe it is, right? Because I'm trying to show something to, you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of Irish histories of specific counties and places in the famine. And I'm trying to kind of situate the famine in a bigger context, in a British imperial context.
Well, as a North American, I thank you for writing this book. And I feel like this does so much lifting for real. In Canada and the United States, we have such a large diasporic population of Irish descendant people, and I feel like this is such a great way to kind of get back at the ancestry. After my grandfather died, I was also going back and researching my own genealogy. We come from England, just outside Manchester. Way back in the day, but my family moved here in the 1600s. There's no memory of England, amongst my people. But I think what you talk about is really interesting because of oral histories, right? And what do you do as a scholar about oral histories? Do you take them at face value? How do you interrogate them? You're not trying to be dismissive of the people who are giving their memories, but a lot of times oral histories don't necessarily align directly with fact or other documents. At the same time, this power of memory is incredibly important, right? Because they start to foster this perceived history, starts to foster like this new identity and things like that. So I want to come back a little bit later on and talk about maybe the legacy of the famine and how it continues to maybe. Obviously, with the two reviews this morning, it's still important. People take it very personally, I would imagine, back in Ireland and elsewhere.
Yeah, but I mean, one of the things that struck me, and I'm not trying to like cast aspersion on Ireland, but it is not. There are like the commemorations of the famine in Ireland are oriented towards the diaspora, right? They are not. You know what I mean? Like one of the things I was in Ireland last summer, and I did part of this like famine trail, which is, you could write an amazing history just of the famine trail project, where, it's partly to kind of revive the economic fortunes of the Irish Midlands, which were, struck by the famine as everywhere else was, but are not in comparison with like the west of Ireland, which has made a really impressive kind of tourist trade out of kind of outdoor activities, right? There's these amazing trails that kind of hug the Western Irish coastline, which is this like spectacularly rugged and beautiful part of the world. And the Irish Midlands is like peat bogs on the Royal Canal and farmland, right? And so it's not, but there's this trail with these kind of these bronze shoes along the way, and it's intended to kind of like be this sort of pilgrimage for people from the diaspora, for the most part, to kind of reimagine in this case, it starts at the Irish Famine Museum, which is, I think, privately run in Strokestown, and goes to Dublin. And so it cuts along, and it's meant to follow a specific group of people who were evicted from Strokestown and follow them, about whom we have a lot of material. And so it's like very thoughtfully done. I have a colleague at the University of Toronto, Mark McGowan, who is one of like but it's still, it's ultimately it's for the diaspora. And the real moments of that, at least this is an unscientific, unhistorical, this is my own impression of the real kind of moments of Irish nationalism. And the key are the War of Independence, the Civil War that followed it. If you go to I mentioned it in the book, there's a great museum, which is the Irish National Museum of History and Decorative Arts. And it's in Collins Barracks, which was renamed after Michael Collins. It used to be called, I think, the Royal Barracks or something like that. And it's in front of what was called the Croppies Acre, which is this now, it's a testament to the kind of housing crisis in contemporary Dublin, because now it's like people sleeping rough, right, who live in this little acre of land in front of the Collins Barracks. It's not really a full acre, but it's the Croppies Acre. Anyway, people who died in the 1798 rebellion were allegedly buried there. And the barracks itself were really close. The first soup kitchens in Phoenix Park, which I mentioned in the book, were nearby, so that if there was trouble, the soldiers who were stationed at the barracks would be able to kind of deploy quickly, right? So it's part of the geography of Dublin during the famine is right there. But the museum itself, which is terrific, has, one display on the famine, right? That's probably like the size of, it's got some cool stuff there and some things that I really wanted to see, including a 19th century potato hoe that was made entirely of wood, right? At a time when like iron goods were prohibitively expensive for a lot of Irish laborers. So they have great stuff, but, there's an entire floor about, relevant actually to Black 47. There's an entire floor about Irish military service abroad, which has some amazing objects, but the famine just doesn't loom that large. I think because it doesn't loom as large as you would think, considering the importance of the famine I think that it's important to the history of the Irish nation in Ireland, but it is crucially important to the diaspora in a way that it isn't, right? Britain did a lot of other bad stuff to the Irish in Ireland between the famine and the Good Friday Agreement in 1998.
Yeah,
you know
absolutely.
what I mean? And for the Irish diaspora, right, that was, they got to New York and, no Irish need apply or whatever, which wasn't really the case in Quebec, where my own family went, right? They were, they might speak English or Irish, but they were Catholic. And so they were pretty quickly sorted into the kind of the oppressed Catholic majority in Quebec, lorded over by the dour Scots Presbyterians. But it's just a different story. And so I was really interested to see. I'm interested to see how the book is received in Ireland. Because I have a sense. I have like from previous work, I have a sense of how the book might be received in Britain, and everything. The British culture war is really, really on this. I hopefully no British people listen to this. Like really, the battle lines are really clear, and both sides don't necessarily have the most sophisticated approach to the points they're trying to make. Right? It's either empire bad or empire good, right? And it's never. And in my own work on anti-slavery, it's I've tried to argue that anti-slavery served the empire in complicated ways. But, for one side of the culture war, it's like, well, Britain interdicted slave ships, therefore the empire was good. And then for the other side, it's Britain's interdiction of the slave ships didn't actually change anything, which isn't true either, right? So I'm curious, like I can see how this book to British audiences will be seen as just another like the British were bad book, where in fact I think that I'm trying to show that the like the empire's complicated, and that the policies hurt a lot of people, but that doesn't mean that every single right. Like I'm trying to make less one-dimensional some of the characters who were responsible for especially directly administering famine relief. Like it was a very, very, very difficult job to be a commissary agent in Ireland in 1846, or to be a soldier, or to be responsible. Like they worked really hard doing something that ultimately didn't help anybody, or helped very few people, and didn't actually stop the catastrophe. So I don't know how, and whereas I think the diaspora here, and I think Basic, my US publishers are hoping will tap into like the really big market for stories about Ireland and Irishness in North America. And it's striking, actually, the British version of the book doesn't have the word imperial in the title, in part because, it says it's like when LeBron
sell
James
books.
Yeah, exactly. It's like when LeBron sits out the All-Star game, right? It's a business decision, right?
Absolutely.
Even though it's an imperial story, yeah. So
no, and I feel like one of the strengths of the book, I come to this, my background is in Indigenous history, right? Academics are trained to think empire bad, and that's not necessarily the case. I'm sorry to offend folks, but that's true. Things exist in shades of gray, and
yeah.
I think that's the thing coming to your book. It's like, okay, Imperial History, Irish Famine, England is bad, and everyone in England is bad, and England only has the worst intentions for all Irish people. Then you go, wait a second, oh no, they were actually trying to do what they could to stop this famine. They recognized it was these people were hurting. They weren't successful in a lot of different ways, but that doesn't take. It's like there wasn't this great malevolent attack on Ireland. But we'll get into this. Padraic, before we jump into the film itself, do we want to lay out a couple ideas about where England and Ireland are, say in 1845, 1847? What's this relationship between the empire and the island like at this point in time? And then also, like, what is this famine? I think we're I don't want to take for granted as people are listening that they understand, that they know what the famine was, or the catastrophe that unfolds. Because this movie takes place in 1847. We're 2 years into it. Can we talk? Let's lay out some basics for listeners here, because this film is amazing. I like this film a lot. A lot of people have not seen this film, so I don't want to just make assumptions for folks.
Yeah, sure. So the Irish Famine was a long-lasting famine in Ireland that lasted from 1845 until, really 1851, maybe 1852, depending on where in Ireland. But it was caused by the repeated, nearly annual failure of Ireland's potato crops due to an epidemic of a fungus-like water mold called, and I always mispronounce, like Phytophthora infestans or P. infestans, right? That still exists. Is still a major multi-billion-dollar pest of potato crops. And it afflicts both potatoes and tomatoes, but it hits tomatoes less often because it thrives in better and cooler, wetter conditions. And tomatoes tend to thrive better in drier, sunnier conditions. So it can kill other nightshades, but it mostly kills potatoes. And so it was brought to Ireland. It was part of a widespread global, everywhere they grew potatoes virtually in this era. It was kind of like a potato pandemic. It spread from Peru, where potatoes are grown both for commercial agriculture and grow wild. They're native to Central and South America. Especially the northern parts of Central and South America, and especially to the actual organism that caused the potato blight came from the volcanic valleys outside of Mexico City, where potatoes also grow, both as a food crop and also wild. And so there's more genetic diversity there, and also different growing conditions that tend to be drier. But it was really like the arrival of this pathogen from North America or maybe from South America, either on a shipment of seed potatoes or in a shipment of fertilizer that started in the Low Countries in either Belgium or Netherlands. People think Belgium, but maybe the Netherlands. Also places that depended on potatoes that wiped out European potato crops in 1845. And then in some ways, like the potato blight was worse in other places than Ireland in 1845. It was more catastrophic. But no place other than Ireland experienced the kind of repeated waves of blight that in part because Ireland kept planting potatoes. So one of the things that kind of stopped or arrest, like Belgian potato farmers continued to have to fight blight, but they had other crops and they developed, ways of, building fire breaks in their fields to try to prevent the sporulation. And they didn't have a sense of the sporulation, but they had kind of like empirical ways of trying to spread out their farms or diversify their crops in order to mitigate the possibility of potato failure. That didn't happen in Ireland, where potatoes remain a monocrop. Anyway, the consequences in Ireland were the deaths of about 1 million people, maybe more, maybe slightly fewer, mostly from diseases associated with famine rather than actual starvation, especially typhus, dysentery, and influenza. And then the emigration in the course of the famine between about 2 to 3 million people from Ireland, mostly to North America and Britain, but also to Australia and New Zealand and all over the place, but primarily to North America. And people with more money went to the United States, and people with less money went to Canada, basically. Or with, I guess, more expedition, people went to the United States than to Canada. And then Ireland's population continued to decline until almost the 1940s. So Ireland had about between 8 and 8.5 million people in 1841 in the UK census. In the 1930s, it had about 4 million people. And Ireland today is the only country in Europe that has fewer people in the present than it did in the 1840s. It's the only country that's had that sustained population. I mean, the Ireland's population is increasing now, but it is still significantly less than it was in 1845. So that was the potato famine. And the position of the UK to Ireland is that they were one country, which is something that is, again, I'm not trying to cast aspersion on the excellent National Museum of Ireland History and Decorative Culture in Collins Barracks, Dublin, but you could be forgiven if you didn't know, visiting the museum, that Ireland was in fact part of the United Kingdom from 1801 until the Irish War of Independence breaking, you know what I mean, until the early 1920s or until the Easter Rising in 1916. So yeah, they were a single polity. Ireland was never a British colony, but it was under British control for a really long time, beginning in the Middle Ages when the Anglo-Norman lords of England conquered Ireland and established what became the kind of like old Irish aristocracy. So, for example, like whenever you see Fitz in an Irish name, it's from Norman, right? It's Fis. So it's like Fitzwilliam is son of William. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So
Fitzgerald. Okay,
yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, that makes sense now. Okay.
Yeah. So that lasted, on and off with kind of uneven, like it wasn't always direct rule by England. And so to think like in the Middle Ages, the degree to which England could actually control Ireland was relatively limited. And various English kings, including Henry VIII, attempted to found what were called plantations, to kind of basically plant English settlers in Ireland in order to sort of start to carve out chunks of the country that could be systematically anglicized to actually make real, like Henry VIII said, I'm the King of Ireland. But in practice, being the King of Ireland didn't really give him much power. And so there was plantations in Munster that were attempted. And then the most successful one is the Ulster plantation, which is in the early 17th century. Huge numbers of Presbyterian emigrants moved to Ulster, provoking still, like, in some ways, like Irish medieval, like Irish early modern history is more politically charged than famine history, because the question of like who did what to whom in the Ulster plantation really, really, really matters, because those people are all still there. Their descendants are all
Right.
still there.
The conflict of of Irish nationalism. You've got the 6 counties to the
Yeah,
north, right?
yeah,
So yeah.
yeah. So those 6 counties and that distinctive character to Northern Ireland, what's now Northern Ireland, began with the Ulster plantation. And then in the course of and then in the 17th century, this is a long way to get to the point, but you have to understand what happened before in order to understand the relationship between the two countries as the Union. So at the end of the 17th century, there were two sustained wars of conquest in Ireland that are both remembered in Irish nationalist history as moments of profound national humiliation. And the first was the invasion after the English Civil Wars by Oliver Cromwell's New Model Army, which resulted in there's all of these there's a mythic history of that as well too, and there's a lot of debates as to whether or not how many Catholics massacred how many Protestants massacred how many Catholics. Suffice to say, there were like certainly massacres on both sides of both. And it was a really like a kind of holy war, at least, if not for Cromwell himself. There have been kind of revisionist historians lately who have tried to show that, in fact, Cromwell had a much more like kind of realpolitik vision of the conquest of Ireland. But certainly for many of his soldiers and supporters, it was it was a holy war against Catholicism, against popery, and like the Whore of Babylon, right? And so, that was one defeat. And that was when they attempted to drive the Catholics to the kind of westernmost province of Connaught. And so to Hell or Connaught was allegedly the like, where are you going to go? You're going to go to Hell or to Connaught. And whether or not that actually happened, who knows? But we did substantially begin the dispossession of the Catholic landlord class, which was then solidified after the Glorious Revolution in England, when after this is all set within the religious wars of the 17th century, right? So this is an era when James II, the last Stuart king, is a Protestant, not a Protestant. He's a Catholic. That's what's important. And so there's a question after the English Civil Wars and the restoration of the Stuarts, and they dig up Cromwell's body and put it on trial, and the Stuarts are restored, but James II is still a Catholic. And so there's a moment when it seems like, oh, maybe the civil wars will begin again, when it's clear that James is going to inherit the throne. But James is old, and his oldest child is a staunch Protestant, Mary, of William and Mary fame. And she's married to William of Orange, who is one of the like fiercest defenders of the Protestant cause on the continent. And so they don't worry in the exclusion crisis, because it seems better to have like an old, like 50-year-old Catholic whose heir is a Protestant. That's better than having a renewal of the Civil War. But then James remarries. He marries Mary of Modena, and he has a son. And that sets into motion the Glorious Revolution, where a group of Whig, Protestant Whig, everyone in England is Protestant except for the king. Whig landlords and parliamentarians invite William of Orange to invade England and expel, and James flees, and he flees to Ireland. And then William of Orange pursues him there. And in this battle, which is enormously significant in Irish nationalist history, the Battle of Boyne, which was in fact like not a particularly it's more significant because of what happened there rather than it wasn't an epical battle in terms of its scale or in terms of the combat, but it was one of the last battles in European history where two monarchs faced each other on the battlefield. Like both James was there and William of Orange was there. And it was also it was like not as decisive a defeat as it is remembered as being for the Catholic forces, for the royal, like the Stuart forces. But it was a defeat, and it was part of a pretty decisive defeat of the Stuarts everywhere in Ireland. It's just the Boyne happened to be the place where the two people faced each other on the battlefield. And so those two wars of conquest definitively ended the kind of any pretensions of the Catholic aristocracy to retake Ireland. And they were systematically dispossessed in the course of the 18th century through a series of laws called the penal laws. And as I try to point out in the book, the penal laws on paper banned basically every aspect of Catholic belief and practice. But in reality, people who were, one thing it did do was exclude Catholic prelates from Ireland. So like what emerged as Catholicism in Ireland was very unique in Europe. Like it was very like a folk Catholic belief, because there was a lot less kind of episcopal control over individual Catholics. And so a lot of wild beliefs kind of emerged from that era. But if you're a Catholic landlord, you lost your land or you converted. And so by the end of the 18th century, like most of Irish land was in the hands of a pretty small caste of either old Anglo-Irish Protestant nobility, who had a much more ambivalent attitude to Britain than the new Protestant ascendancy, the new kind of new Anglo-Irish, or not even Anglo-Irish, like the new landlord class. And so Ireland in the course of the 18th century became a in my view at least, became a kind of quasi-colony of Britain. And the Irish economy was oriented more and more towards Britain. And when it was tried to break free from Britain was through various regulations that are not kind of boring to talk about it. You can read the book and learn about them. Irish land became oriented towards exporting rent and food to Britain. And then, at the end of the 18th century, in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, a Protestant, like notionally Protestant, but really kind of like like a kind of classic American Revolution, French Revolution era freethinker, Theobald Wolfe Tone, led what was called the United Irish Rising, which was a rising of sort of it was very like, and it was seen, and there had been plenty of Irish risings, but this one was seen as especially dangerous because it was oriented toward, it looked like Napoleon, right? It looked like a French Revolution. It didn't look like it wasn't like a sectarian war. It wasn't a religious war, although there were certainly sectarian elements to it. And then one of the consequences of that was the Act of Union. And so in 1800, so it's a long-winded way to get there. So in 1800, both the Irish Parliament voted to dissolve itself, and in exchange, 100 Irish MPs went to Westminster. Irish bishops went to the House of Lords. Irish lords got to sit in the House of Lords. And so Ireland became integrated into a new polity that existed for the first time, the United Kingdom. Before that, it had been Great Britain. And now it was the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And so that new polity on paper was a single, Irish people could move across the Irish Sea. You didn't need papers internally. There were no internal trade barriers. They had one currency. In 1829, the restrictions that remained on Catholic participation in political life were removed. They were one country, but Ireland remained the kind of junior partner in the Union. And a lot of the kind of economic forces that had been built in this sort of colonial era of the 18th century continued into the 19th century as a single market. So the pressures didn't change. And Ireland's position in the Union was on paper equal, but in practice, it was the difference in size between these two economies and the difference in overall power between these two economies was enormous. So Ireland was, in my view, exploited, squeezed for money, squeezed for rent, and endured all of the kind of growing pains of imperial capitalism most acutely, because the Irish poor were the most vulnerable to them. And so that sets the table for the famine. The fact that Ireland is a weird thing because it's not really a colony. It's certainly not a colony, but it's not really, it's also subordinate. Like the Irish poor in particular are explicitly racialized in British public opinion, right? So you have like the Duke of Wellington is, Arthur Wellesley is the son of a very long, old Anglo-Irish Protestant family. And so there are like the most famous war hero of the 19th century is Irish. There are Irish MPs, there are Irish ministers. Like the Irish are not like the educated, wealthy Irish, including Irish Catholics after Catholic emancipation, are not excluded from British political life, and in fact participate in it in a lot of different ways. And as as you can see in Black 47, Irish soldiers serve the British Army all around the world. And so, and without in some ways, when they're abroad, they feel they're both they're Irish, but they're also part of the union, they're part of the empire.
There's this form of acceptance.
Yeah, but they're like part of the empire, and they are a part, like the tip of the imperial spear in some ways. Although it might be said the Indian Army is that, but at the same time, Ireland itself is militarized, right? So and Ireland, there are still elements of quasi-colonial rule in the way that Ireland is governed. So, for example, there are things called coercion acts, which are specific laws that are they're intended for emergencies. Right, they're equivalent to something like in Canada we have the Emergencies Act, right, which gives the federal government power to suspend civil liberties and suspend the rule of law in times of crisis. And so the last time the Emergencies Act was invoked was in the pandemic in Canada in the trucker convoy in Ottawa. And that has become until the trade war began, was like a real dividing line in Canadian politics. Anyway, it's neither here nor there. The point is that the coercion acts were intended to be for emergencies, and the British government used them, I think, 17 times between 1801 and 1845. So this emergency legislative device was being used routinely anytime Ireland became restive. So Ireland is not it's part of the UK, but it's also not part of the UK. And if you were a wealthy Catholic intellectual living in Dublin or living in Edinburgh or living in London in 1845, you might joke around. People might make jokes about your Irishness, but it certainly wouldn't exclude you from much. But if you were a poor Irish peasant or Irish farm laborer, you were certainly seen by, and sometimes by those very same Catholic intellectuals, but certainly by wider British popular culture as being quasi-savage and somebody who was not really who was substantially different in their civilization and in their culture and in their racial identity from the rest of the country. So it's a hugely complicated relationship. And I think anyone should be skeptical of the attempts to kind of rip the common history of Ireland and Britain apart, serve purposes in both Ireland and Britain, but deny the reality of how the empire was governed in the 19th century. Sorry, that's a really long answer to the question, but it's a really complicated relationship.
I feel like it's important because I think a lot of people who are listening to this pod are now going to actually go hopefully watch this film, and it kind of sets the tone because as we walk into the film, we're in the middle of things as we walk into the film.
Yeah.
Which now brings us to the film itself. For those of you listening, now we are 46 minutes into the movie podcast in which we have yet to talk about the film. This is actually, Padraic, not uncommon on this pod.
Okay, good.
So I want to ask you: had you seen Black 47 before we were going to watch this film?
No, I hadn't heard of it. And I had not heard of it. Although I recognized obviously it's loaded with famous faces.
Mm-hmm.
But I hadn't heard of it. And I looked it up after and read a bunch of the reviews after watching it. And it seems like it didn't really make much of an impact. I think it did well in Ireland when it was first released, in part from the novelty of which struck me. There had never been a film made about the famine before, which was really might have driven
shocking.
It. Yeah. So yeah, I had not seen it. And I, in fact, before we turned our backs on Amazon as part of our obligation to our nation, I got a 30-day preview of IFC to watch it, and then canceled it. Yeah.
Very good. We did this on the watch party a few years ago that we do on Sunday nights, and back when we were on Twitter and back in the before times, now that we're on Blue Sky. And you're right. It's I was if we have this moment that is so important, certainly to the Irish diaspora, as you were saying. It's strange that we haven't had a famine film, and this film comes out of it. It's an Irish production, which I really
Yeah.
liked. I like the idea of knowing this, of being able to see the famine through an Irish lens. What were your impressions of the film as you watched it? I mean,
I mean,
how do you feel about it?
I gotta say, I found it. I kept checking to see how long it was. It felt about 5 hours long, even though it was 80 minutes.
Yeah.
I don't know. I didn't really think, truthfully, I didn't think much of it.
Right.
I thought of it as like the famine was a setting for basically Rambo,
Thank
right?
you.
Like it's basically First Blood, but with like Sean O'Rambo instead of Rambo. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it does, right? It just feels, and I think that can be fun ways to play with history, is to do something like this, because you're absolutely right. It feels like an American Western at times when
Yeah.
and then you've got an Irish superhero.
I mean, I definitely do appreciate something like, you don't see a lot of period pieces about the 19th century where you have kind of like disturbed former soldiers in imperial service returning to wreak havoc in the United Kingdom. So I appreciated that, and it just kind of shows like the way that, to me, I was like, it's interesting. You don't often see, like, you see the kind of era of movies about imperial wars is long gone. Like my father-in-law loves Zulu.
We
You
just
know
did
what I
that,
mean?
yeah.
And loves the scene. I mean, my wife's family are Welsh, and he's from South Wales. And there's a tear in his eye, right, when they're all singing. You know, they all sing. I forget if they sing "Bread of Heaven." You know, it's one of those things where like everybody in the Irish diaspora is like either the descendant of a king or a horse thief, when in fact most people are just descendants of farmers. Right, like that's what you were. You were like agricultural laborers, but it's much more romantic to be a king who lost his crown, or her queen who lost her crown, or to have been somebody who was like convicted for stealing the Lord's horse. And like everybody in Wales thinks that their grandparents wrote this hymn, "Bread of Heaven." Feed me till I want no more, which they sing at Welsh the supporters sing in Welsh at rugby matches. But yeah, it was interesting. It was this Western. It had like kind of a John Wick element to it too,
Very much
in
so.
the sense that this guy, what's his name? Feeney? No,
Feeney.
Yeah,
Feeney.
Hannah is Agent Smith. He's Hugo Weaving, right?
Yes.
And so he's just like a super soldier, right? He just can't be killed, right? And he's like it, and I found that quite interesting. Like there were some good action sequences. I'll say that I found it, but it was interesting. It was kind of like a self-orientalizing as an Irish project. You know what I mean? They use that kind of, I forget what it is. Like they call it like they have like an Irish version of the movie Traffic, the Soderbergh movie, where everything in Mexico looks like it's seen through, like it's all yellow, and everything here is
everything's blue. Yeah,
everything is kind of blue gray, and I think the final sequence where the final kind of battle in the barracks is pretty good. And when the guy who I guess hadn't quite broken through, I can't remember the actor's name, gets shot for
Barry Keoghan.
Barry Keoghan, gets blown away. And he gets and so there were some moments that clearly I like stood out, but broadly I thought it was a bit forgettable, but for the fact that it's about the famine.
Yeah, for me, I was like, okay, this is the only film I can think of that's talking about the famine itself. I was like, so can I take this film and curate it as I'm talking to somebody about, because it's like, aside from the shades of blue, apparently Ireland, which is known for being green, is entirely blue.
And it's never sunny.
No, I mean, there's no sun in Ireland.
But like that's also, I mean, it does rain a lot, but I will say like one of the things that is kind of, and we can talk more, I'm sure we'll dig into the movie more, but one of the things that's really striking is that, the winter of 1847 was brutal, and especially cold. And so they capture that well. But in some ways, like the summers were worse historically for famine in Ireland because they were the time between when the supply of potatoes of the previous year was at its least. It is kind of the period where people's supplies of potatoes from the previous harvest were exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
And it was before the harvest of the people's potato beginning in kind of late August and early September. So it would be interesting to think about, like, to imagine this happening under kind of like sunny summer skies, right? Rather than in this bleak winter, because that would have been in a way, amidst people like lining up for soup kitchens, because it was the summer of 1847. That was when the British relief efforts, or the Relief Commission, established soup kitchens and got rid of the public works system and replaced them with soup kitchens. So you don't really see much about what's actually, the famine is the setting, right? It's a kind of like a post-apocalyptic setting for a revenge story. And it's not clear exactly and he takes revenge on basically every aspect of British political economy in Ireland. He gets he shoots a missionary. He kills a land agent.
Right.
He hangs a hanging judge, who hanged his brother. Yeah, so he hits all the beats. You know what I mean?
This is an anti-imperial film, right? I mean,
yes, absolutely.
This is very much an Irish nationalist kind of,
kind of
film.
And he fights Hugo Weaving is like, he never fought for the king; he only fought for his mates. Fucking right. Irish, around the fire. It's just like, and it's just like, it's such I'm not sure that many British soldiers fought for the king either. Not least because it wasn't a king; it was a queen, right, from 1837, right? So he fought for the queen, unless his military career had started unless he had been shipped over to fight in Afghanistan, and his unit didn't fight in Afghanistan anyway. So, the Connaught Rangers did not actually participate in the Afghan war. So,
right.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I mean, because they wanted an Irish sounding unit, right? I guess a historically Irish unit, even though there were Irish soldiers in basically every British military unit. So you could have, but it wouldn't have sounded quite as dramatic to say he was in a non-commissioned officer in the 45th Regiment of Foot. It doesn't have quite the same sting as the Rangers, which evokes the Army Rangers in the U.S., right? It makes him seem like a special, he's a tier 1 operator of the British Army, come back to strike a blow against the Empire.
Well, that, and it's the symbolism, say, with the knife that he picks up in, I guess, Afghanistan or India. I forget which one. These are very colonialized spaces. Hugo Weaving's just like, oh, he learned that in Afghanistan. It's like he's very much
when he cuts off the guy's head, right?
Yeah,
and puts it on the spike. Yeah,
I mean, he's very much. It's almost like he's. I hate to use this phrase, but gone native. He's using very much these weapons of the people who have been colonized by the UK against the British Empire itself, right? He's bringing that warfare,
right? It's they used guns, you know what I mean? The Afghan forces had firearms, right?
Yes.
That's kind of
the thing I kept thinking about when we talk about the casual brutality was the scene where his sister-in-law and her family are evicted from the home. They burn they take the roof or something.
Yes, which really happened, right? But not then. That was unroofing is definitely Sarah Green, who has nothing to do in this movie.
So what is the justification behind unroofing? Because you're like, okay, these people are going to freeze to death tonight.
Yeah, I mean, it's just basically that. The unroofing is truly one of the things that it's something that's so appalling that John Russell, who in many ways is responsible for a lot of the catastrophe of 1847. I mean, responsible is not quite fair. He was the prime minister during 1847, and Russell, in his policies and his government's policies, we're not genocidal, right, as we talked about earlier, but we're definitely didn't help, and in many ways, we're offered opportunities for people who were stronger or richer to basically like climb over the bodies of people who were weaker and poorer in order to hold on to something and survive. Not that there's anything like, you know what I mean? Like under those conditions, it's hard to imagine what anyone would do. Right. So I'm not trying to say like, but anyway, but unroofing was something that even Russell tried to intervene to stop. So the idea was like when people were evicted, you wouldn't tear down the cottages themselves because they might be useful for other tenants, but you would remove the thatch from the roof to make the house effectively uninhabitable and to signal, because you didn't want to knock down the actual frame of the house, you knocked down, you could just pull down the thatch of the roof and make the house uninhabitable and force people to move. And it would often be done, like it sometimes happened at gunpoint. There's instances in Rot where that happens. And a lot of people were evicted in the course of the famine, although, the evictions really were stepped up in part after Black 47. There were evictions, and evictions were a feature of the life of the Irish poor from before the famine and continued well after the famine. But the real, the moments when evictions really stepped up were when the Encumbered Estates Commission began to sit in 1848, if I remember correctly, which was intended to kind of like because there were all these Irish landlords, especially smaller Irish landlords and tenants who were so deeply underwater in debt from the famine that couldn't be removed. They themselves could not be evicted, right? Because no one would buy their land with all of the encumbrances that came on it, right? So the encumbrances are all of the historical leases and penalties and mortgages. And in some cases, these were like 150 years of complex debt. So, estate lawyers would salivate over Irish estates, at the complexity of them, but then kind of step away when they realized that even if they were to sell this estate, they wouldn't get any money because the owners were so deep underwater. And so the Encumbered Estates Commission was a commission that was appointed to basically figure out a way to get landlords who were deeply in debt in Ireland to be able to sell their land so they could leave. And selling and like free up that capital. And selling the land meant evicting people, right? And often it meant evicting people in really complicated ways, right? Because like the Irish system, there was I describe it as being almost like a pyramid scheme, right? In the sense that, everyone is a landlord and everyone is a tenant except for the people at the very bottom. So, in England, farmers, if you hear someone described as a farmer in 19th century England, they're pretty well-to-do. Like farmers have capital. So the landlord is usually an aristocrat. There's a relatively small number of aristocrats and Oxford colleges and Cambridge colleges who own most of England, right? And rent it out to people who are going to often who have capital themselves and often enter into pretty complicated partnerships with aristocrats to improve the land. So an English farmer would lease, say, like 1,000 acres of land, and then would employ laborers for wages to work the land, often with sort of even a separate level of sort of senior farm laborers who would have cottages, and they would be responsible for organizing labor, right? So it's a much more it's a smaller system there. It's like the landlord and the farmer are, but in Ireland, no, there's so little capital that the farmers who lease land lease much smaller parcels of land, often at rents that are wildly disproportionate to the productivity of the land, right? It all floats on the market. And so rents keep driving up, even though the amount of money you can make from the land from actually growing crops remains static. And since you don't have capital, you can't improve the land, so you can't actually drive up your yields. So the way that the solution that emerges is to subdivide the land and subdivide the land and subdivide the land and subdivide the land until you have all of these tiny parcels of land of people paying rent upward and upward and upward, like sucking cash out of Ireland and sending it back to England. And so those are the people who would get unroofed, right? Those people who are at the bottom of the hierarchy. And often they would get unroofed even when they had paid their rent, right? Because it wasn't that they were getting evicted for being in arrears. They were being evicted because the person who held the lease above their lease, who held the lease above their lease, who held the lease above their lease decided to sell. And now there was a new owner, and with a new owner, you don't have to honor those leases. And so those people are gone, right? And so the brutality of the evictions was unique to Ireland, maybe, but the mechanism was not that dissimilar to anybody in the British Empire being evicted after a tenant being evicted after the land that they rented was sold to someone else. And so that's the scene that happens with Sarah Green's character, who barely does anything in the movie. And she's like one of the several famous faces in the movie who does very little. Like, she's the star of the Dublin Murders series, and a bunch of other stuff. And has maybe 4 lines and then freezes to death. And then that's it for, and then I don't think there's
collect a check.
Yeah. Collects. Yeah. I guess the money, the Black 47 money spends anyway. So those are those scenes. And that's a very, like, that actually happened. Those kinds, and they were that brutal. So that's not every single one of them was that brutal, but that's not in my view, that's not like that's not an embellishment of the past. That's a dramatization of a real phenomenon that happened a lot. And the people living in, like, the lean-to made out of chunks of sod, that's also something that happened a lot. And a lot of those people would either die, right? Or they would leave. And, they were among the people, right? The kinds of, like, one of the things that's not necessarily as accurate in the film is the small number of people who are on the roads, right? Like, in a way, it's Ireland now with 4 million fewer people than it had then. Like, those groups of people heading down towards basically walking on often poorly maintained roads to port cities to get out of Ireland. If they were really poor, to Liverpool, if they had more money, to America, or to America via Liverpool, those would have been hundreds of people, right? Those kind of groups. It wouldn't just be one family. It would be, because this was happening all around the country. Like, something like 3% of Ireland emigrated in 1847, which is like an unthinkably large proportion.
I feel like, Padraic, like, one of the strengths of this film when it gets to those kinds of situations is to show the bleakness, the direness. I think a lot in the discourse of the history of, say, the United States, and I would assume as much in Canada, is this question over, like, settler colonialism as people have moved in, displacing Indigenous people and things like that, trying to create new lives for themselves. Here in North America and elsewhere, I think oftentimes the push factors get maybe sometimes dismissed or underplayed on just you. And I talk about this with my own ancestors, right? You don't get on a rotting ship and travel across a sea to great uncertainty if things aren't just awful. If there's any sense of hope or direction, or that things are going to get better where you are, you don't take these chances unless things are that awful, right?
I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I think, like, a couple of things. One is that, like, I think there are these distortions that make, one of the things that I try to like, we talked about this earlier, but try to puncture a little bit in the book, is the idea of the Irish experience. Like, the Irish famine was extreme, but the 19th century was also, like, a period of rapid population growth in Europe and in the Americas, and of mass immigration. And, so the Irish were only one of many European groups to emigrate in huge numbers in the course of the 19th century to the United States and Canada and Australia, and, like, to Britain's colonies of settlement and to the United States. So, I think, like, there were, and in a way, like, the thing that made the emigration and the famine different was how hurried it was, because people had been leaving Ireland for everywhere else for a really long time. Like, there had been, it's just that in the 18th century, right, something like, I forget exactly the proportion, I put it in the book, but something like 17% of the non-enslaved population of the United States at independence was Irish born, right? But they were Protestants, right? They were mostly from Ulster, which was, also had its own economic, it had different economic problems. In part, Ulster was, in the famine, was relatively less badly hit, in part because it was the only place that had something approaching industrialization in its shipyards, which are still really important. That's where the Titanic was built, right, in the Belfast shipyards. And so Although I guess they didn't do the best job, but I guess they ran out of an ice crab. They
The
didn't
ship was
staff.
fine. The ship was
Yeah, the ship was
wasn't
fine.
designed to run into a
Yeah,
continental size iceberg.
they should have built it. They should have built it better. But yeah,
Yes.
I'm not like it's definitely like I think the character of it in the famine. Like one of the things I'm working on now, some stuff about factories and about kind of industrialization. That's my next project has to do with that. And I've been looking at one of the chapters of that project, or one of the dimensions of it, is the impact of Irish emigration to the UK. I mean, that's not. See, I'm already falling into the same pattern because it was the UK internal migration within the UK from Ireland to England,
Right.
and the degree to which that really colored a lot of urban, like it really had a profound impact on Britain's cities in the 19th century. And so a lot of those people, right, and that happened before and after the famine. And it's just like it was the people who came during the famine who were the most desperate. And who really fled, right? So, one of the memorials to the famine here in Canada is right at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River near Quebec City, the Grosse Ile quarantine station, which was where, not without justification, Irish immigrants were kept in quarantine because so many of them had typhus and so many of them died, right? And so that's like, and there's also, I'm going to see my in-laws and my brother in Montreal for the school March break here in Ontario next week. And, I'm going to drag my son to the Black Rock in Montreal, which is this famine to, which maybe my daughter too, although she won't she's pre-literate. So we'll have less of an impression on her. But to this rock that commemorates the people who died in these ships. Right. So, and they're called coffin ships, right? And they were miserable conditions. But the passage across the Atlantic in 1845 wasn't like the passage across the Atlantic in a sailing ship, right? It didn't take that long. It's just that everyone was so miserably sick. And so I feel like in the diasporic memory, it's become like the British forced the Irish onto these ships and they died there. But it's like they were dying when they got on. And the ships were, it's still this the horror of it is still, you could still feel it. But the idea that it was like, I guess like this movie doesn't necessarily like line up with the argument of the book, because this is a movie about villainous Brits.
Oh yeah.
Right. There are no good Brits in this movie except for the traitor to the cause, except for Hannah, right?
Yeah.
Who's secretly in league. Or I mean, I may not have been. I was like, was he actually in league? Was he always in league, or did he just like change his mind? That I could not figure out from the film, whether or not Hannah's sympathy for Feeney caused him to help him to escape in the end, or whether or not they had in fact coordinated in advance. And that question was never answered. And like, what's his name? Who plays Lord
Pope?
Lord?
Yeah.
Pope is evil too. Like it's
Pope
all
is evil
Brits. Yeah.
Oh, you're thinking Pope is going to be this wide, like this, this young kid who's gonna. It's like, and he just gets worse as the movie goes on.
He is doing like, this guy is a multiple murderer. You know what I mean? At this point, he's on a killing, like Feeney is on a killing spree.
Oh, at that point in time, it's like, what are you supposed to do with a big knife?
Yeah, but Pope won't. Yeah, so Pope, you can tell. I knew as soon as I saw him, and I knew as soon as I saw. Oh, what's the actor's name? He's really good. He plays Lord Lord Kilmartin.
Yeah.
He's in a million things. He's like a very, very famous and decorated British actor. And I was like, they are doing the two classic evil Brit kind of stereotypes. And, so, I feel like one of the things that's interesting about the movie is how much the army is around and how little the commissariat is around, right? Because there's all of these, and the commissariat wore pseudo-military uniforms. And so this is like this is the department of the British Armed Forces that is responsible for logistics. And they were in a way, they were like the main branch of the British Armed Forces who had the most to do with managing famine relief. The Commissariat Division, which had many, many, many successes, especially, and like in a way, like the kinds of officers, military officers who would serve in Ireland would not necessarily be the cream of the crop. But the Commissariat sent its best officers to try to manage this. And like, so all of the kinds of people who were recruited by the commissary department were all had notable successes. Like one of them was involved, like Randolph Routh, who was the head of it, the commissary general, who was kind of one of the main organizers of practical famine relief in the course of the famine, had served in the Peninsular War, right, and had helped to had managed British supply lines under so these were accomplished, but you never see them. You only see redcoats and Royal Irish Constabulary, and they're all bad. And they're all evil, and they're all either traitors to the cause, like they're Quislings if they're Royal Irish Constabulary, or they're Brits. Or then you have Barry Keoghan's character, who is supposed to be English, but is not doing a very good English accent if he is supposed to be English.
How do you cast Barry Keoghan as an Englishman? You know?
Yeah, I mean, he's just he's doing his best to do. It's kind of like when you watch like in The Wire, and Idris Elba's British accent keeps slipping through again and again and again. And it's
actually found Dominic West's English accent. Or is
McNulty too. He's
Welsh, isn't he?
I think he's like a aristocratic Irishman.
Is that's weird? Okay, yeah.
But he has a very plummy kind of British accent. Is his real accent, and McNulty, or I mean, there's loads. I mean, The Wire is loaded with Irish, or the guy who plays
Aidan.
And he also is constantly accidentally slipping into his Irish accent as well. So I found that kind of fun, and he's because he's this untried, brand new green private. He hasn't been hardened yet by the experience of overseas service. So he's like, we're shooting the wrong people. And then the idea that he would be just blown away by his one of the things my wife is also an historian and works on law in the British Empire and works a lot on the death penalty. And one of the things that I found most implausible in the movie is that Feeney's brother would have been hung and not transported. You know what I mean? Like there are a lot of laws on the books in the British Empire, the punishment for which is death. They are not that frequently enforced. And the idea that you would be hung in front of a jury, there's still jury trials in Ireland, right? This is the United Kingdom. And if there is a coercion act in force, it doesn't give judges riding circuit the power of summary justice to just hang people whenever they feel like it, right? It gives the British Army the power to arrest people without a warrant and to hold them indefinitely. It suspends habeas corpus, but it doesn't give them likewise. I found it implausible that Hannah would be drumhead courted and just shot in front of at the barracks and not sent back to London, to stand trial. If it was that significant a crime, if it was that significant, there was just a lot of play with, I think one of the things that is hard to grasp, and that, I talk about, we talk about a lot at home, and that I try to grasp, I don't do as well, because I don't really write about the law as much, is how much the British, the law served the British Empire, but they also kind of believed in it. You know what I mean? They believed in it really deeply. And some of them were bad actors, and some of them thought they were serving the institution. So I found the courtroom scene where, the person is speaking in Irish, and they're like, we're going to send you away to Van Diemen's Land anyway, you little Mick. You know what I mean? I found that kind of it's just not it portrays as I try to bring out in Rot, there were very, very malicious, cruel, and inhumane and evil people who were at work in Ireland. And there were people like that in Britain. But a lot of the catastrophe of the Irish famine was not because of the individual cruelty of sort of a malignant Brits, but rather, it was the structures in play that were like the seeds of the famine were planted way, way, way before. And so, like, it is interesting though that basically Feeney kills at least one of every kind of villain of the Irish system. The only one he misses is a gombeen man, so like a dealer in grain or potatoes or other farm implements at high rates of credit. That's the only person who he doesn't kill. In part because I think explaining why that guy would be evil, you can't do it in a scene like you can with the land agent. And you say the land agent, well, I evicted him. It wasn't my fault. Boom. You know what I mean? Or just like, I hung your brother because he he stole a sheep. The punishment was being transported. I transported him. Blah, like they're all, like, we're going to hang him out the window. I knew he was going to hang him as soon as I saw him as soon as he came into the room and was like, oh, in my court, speak Irish, or whatever he says to him in Irish with you know what I mean? When he's like, he echoes what he said in the courtroom. I also found, I don't know if you ever played the video game Bloodborne.
No.
It's
Go
like
on.
it's neither here nor there, but it's a post-apocalyptic kind of like fantasy. It's from the publisher FromSoft, which made Elden Ring, which is another big hit. But I wrote down in square brackets here, Bloodborne aesthetic, Feeney's outfit. So when Feeney goes hunting, he wears this like big old like leather hat and a big duster, and he looks, that is the aesthetic of the protagonist in this like post-apocalyptic video game Bloodborne. And I was like, I checked to see whether Bloodborne, because I'm not sure that, like, it's a really quite a dramatic outfit that he wears. Like he's going, like what weapons when he goes hunting, right? When they send him out to track, when Hannah goes out to track Feeney across the peatlands there, he's wearing this outfit that suits a kind of post-apocalyptic landscape in a way that I quite like that detail. Although I'm not sure anybody would have actually worn that.
No, I just felt like with a lot of this, there was a conscious modeling on it, like an old Western, of so much of this felt like a Western set in Ireland with Irish specifics. It's so much to me.
And Stephen Ree's character, where he's, I forget his name, but when he chops off the pig's head and puts it on the land agent's head, I guess, I forget whose head he replaces. And then Ree's character says, he'll be ate all the same. Right. And I wrote in my notes, there's no way would that pig actually be ate by the Irish. That pig's corpse would be sold. You know what I mean? Like the pigs were, or maybe like the fact that the dead pig's body was lying there that long without being scavenged in the midst of famine conditions, or that pig that he managed to have in order to decapitate to make that dramatic point, that pig would not, like, the number of livestock in Ireland and also it was a very healthy looking pig, right? Like right. Ireland was a huge supplier of pork to Britain. And the Irish cottage pig was one of the first things in the famine to be slaughtered and sold. Because, people Irish throughout the era of the first half of the 19th century, as I try to argue in the book, Irish laborers used pigs like savings banks, right? Like they couldn't save cash, so they would feed potato scraps to their pigs, knowing that there was a pretty good market for a pig, and that when your pig was fat enough, you could fatten a pig or a couple of pigs, and then, in 6 months you could sell them. And basically you could thereby, because you couldn't really sell your potatoes, or if you could, you sold them for such a pittance that, you couldn't really make a lot of money selling potatoes, although people did sell potatoes. You couldn't transport them very long. And so you would store their value in the body of a pig. And so the presence of a pig is like a good point, right? It's like definitely that is a historical detail that is absolutely accurate. But the fact that the pig is not, like, in 1847, in Black 47, the pig is gone. So it's striking that the pig is still there and hasn't been sold, unless the pig belongs to the land agent, which wasn't clear to me. I wasn't always clear. I have to say, I didn't always follow exactly what was happening.
I was just waiting for the shooting
in
to start.
yeah, exactly. So maybe this is just like spinning my wheels, and maybe like he was saving the pig up.
But I have to ask you, Patrick, where's the wild game in Ireland in 1847? Because we think about, okay, one of the things you explain in the book is this is a monocrop. We know by now, like, people are starving because this crop is dying. There are no
Yeah,
other options. These
yeah,
are people not able to hunt this? Are stuff owned by the higher classes?
yeah.
Are they
I mean,
prohibited
that's a good
from
question. I
harvesting?
mean, in terms of, well, like one of the big questions that the British ask is, why don't the Irish fish? Right. And there's a whole bunch of reasons, like, because there's loads of, right. It's like
Huh.
so and one of
Yeah.
the reasons is that a lot of people pawn their boats when the famine hits, to pay
So
rent.
they can't.
Um, so they actually can't, or they have, there's not a lot of, sort of deep sea worthy craft in
Okay.
Ireland. So they can only really fish close, like, or I mean, look, there are deep sea craft of actual like commercial fishing.
Mhm.
But if you're an average person who has like a cottier or a small farmer and you happen to live near the coast, you don't have access to the kind of boat that you could use. So people ate like seagulls' eggs. They shot seagulls. They would like scrape the barnacles off boats and eat those. Like, it was that people were reduced to eating a lot of stuff that's not, in terms of game, right? A lot of people, I guess if you could catch it, you could eat it. But, a lot of the stuff people just had, like, it's hard to conceive now how, and this is something actually thinking about the reviews of the book that I read this morning. Like, I regret not making it more clear in the book, in the introduction, that when British people thought about, and not all British people, but when like British popular culture conceived of the Irish poor, like the kind of like semi-savage Irish person, they were imagining the Irish poor, right? They were imagining the poorest people in Ireland. It's just that, and those were the people who were struck the hardest by the famine for reasons that are pretty obvious, but who are also the least likely to have any of the kinds of resources that people with even slightly more had, right? So if you had, like, if you wanted to catch a rabbit, let's say, you would need to have either traps or guns or pretty highly trained dogs, right? And so those were all very valuable assets that a cottier someone taking Conacre probably wouldn't have. And so if you were somebody who had, who wasn't renting Conacre and was, say, a small farmer who had 10 acres, let's say, which is a very small amount of land, and an amount of land that would be likely enough. Like, I see it as about 50 acres is what I think of as the potato threshold. So if you have above 50 acres, your diet probably consists of something other than just potatoes. But 50 acres and less, you probably eat almost exclusively potatoes. And the less land you have, the less other things you eat, right? So if you have 50 acres, you might have milk cows too. So you might have like potatoes and cream, right? But if you have a quarter acre, you're just eating potatoes, or potatoes and salt, or potatoes and water. Like, that's basically the entire diet. You know what I mean? It's an extraordinarily monotonous diet, like remarkably monotonous diet. I don't think there's anything like it in Europe in the 19th century. Although I haven't surveyed every diet, you know what I mean? But I can't think of another example. And so I think that that's why, right? Like, the thing is that all of the ways of surviving the famine that were available required some kind of means to be ready to survive, right? So, like the people who are working on like something that's totally invisible in Black 47 and that I found kind of annoying was the complete absence of public works. But this was a time when close to 700,000 people were working on public work sites throughout the Irish countryside. And so the people wouldn't be crowding around the gates of, like, they might be crowding around to try to steal the grain from what's the actor's name? Jim Broadbent. I wrote Jim Broadbent doing some evil Englishman acting. They would be crowded around his estate, but they'd also be crowded around the public work sites, trying to get a ticket to do work on the public work sites to earn wages. And the people who tended to get those, one of the big kind of things that made people really resent those work sites and made the work sites of the kind of violence that you see around Jim Broadbent's. The violence might have been around those work sites rather than around his granary, right? So, there's this just the complete absence in the movie of all of the huge apparatus of kind of very futile, often destructive, counterproductive, but very present kind of make work jobs that were um, a big feature of that winter, because that's the people who died in the winter of 46-47 were the people who were geographically, socially, who were distant from these sites, right? Who were already poor, who were already kind of pariahs within their community. Like the people who died in the way that Sarah Green's character dies were the kind of people who had no connection whatsoever. And it's like kind of interesting that like Feeney clearly has this family, including with lots of different plots of land. And that's the kind of family maybe that might have had somebody working on the work sites, right? And those people, like, the wages were nothing, and one person's wage was expected to often support everybody, right? So it's not like you would still be very vulnerable, but there were like gradations of misery within the famine. And that's something that I like thinking about that in Rot is something that I remember, like, again, not a perfect analogy, like writing about the kind of hierarchy of Caribbean plantations before emancipation, and the way that like the brutality of the system of enslavement pressed on everybody, but there were still people who were able to carve out a little bit more personal autonomy for themselves by virtue of their position within that hierarchy. So everyone is oppressed, but there are people at the bottom, there are people who are at the very bottom and people who are at the top. And I think that those kind of gradations, you don't really capture them. Like, you do get a nice slice of the Catholic educated bourgeoisie in Black 47 when he's on the train with the reporter, the newspaper reporter in the train car. And then the newspaper reporter like gives a little like potted history of Irish political economy in the 19th century, just in case you didn't know what was happening. It's just like, well, the potato is actually an American crop, and he should have like you could read from my book there. But Black 47 was quite a I read. He also murders a Protestant minister for making supers. And they're taking the boat to England with the grain, and that the Lord is personally escorting his own grain to the coast is so, like the fact that he's in Ireland is interesting, and not just like collecting his rents and his income. But he has all these like grotesque opinions about there'll be a moment when like a Celtic Irishman will be as rare as a red Indian in Manhattan, right? And like that is definitely a theory, but it kind of like mixes up different gradations of imperial racism in different eras, because I associate that kind of extirpation idea, the idea that like civilization will extirpate the less, like, not like we don't actually have to, like the British don't actually have to commit genocide in the settler colonies. The force of civilization will kind of tragically erase the uncivilized from the world in a process that will be bloodless and gradual, and they'll just kind of like fade away. And that process is definitely, it's funny because the Irish were considered to be, by the 1860s in the United States, a very useful mechanism for advancing that project of the extirpation of indigenous people from North America. And so it's kind of like exporting it's like pushing back into the past an idea about extirpation that is kind of out of time. There's not, like, people in the 1840s aren't even entirely clear that species go extinct. That's still a matter of serious, that's a matter of serious scientific debate about the speciation and extinction. And this is before the acknowledged by the British genocide of the Aboriginal people of Tasmania, which becomes for Britain for both sides, that becomes like the signal moment of like, oh, actually our actions can eliminate not just species, but human beings, entire cultures. And that that genocidal project becomes like an object of profound disagreement and rhetorical utility on both sides of that debate. So I feel like they put words, like there are lots of, like the movie takes basically a lot of different kinds of British perfidy from the 19th century and compresses them into a period when a smaller number of very specific kinds of British perfidy were at work, which was kind of interesting. But
I have a quick answer to the lack of civil works in the film, and that is because Elon Musk fired them all.
They're all
dosed.
yeah.
They're all dosed by the douche.
Good old Big Balls had his yeah.
He's listening
Anyway.
now, I know. I want to ask you two final questions. The very end of the film, we've got Hannah, who is like now firmly on Team Feely, I suppose, and he's tracking down Pope, and he comes to this another fork in the road from Elon. What do you think? Do you think he goes to America, or does he hunt down Pope? Because we don't know. It leaves us to fill in the blanks here.
I mean, I was thinking about that. I was thinking about that actually as I was like making a sandwich before recording. I don't know. I think he would be caught if he went to America. I think he wants to die. You know what I mean? And I think his plan is to die.
He's going to get this guy.
Yeah. Because I think like he would be, it's the 1840s, so it's not, and there's a lot of people leaving Ireland, but he would be detected. You know what I mean? If you killed as many officials as that, like that's the sort of person that the empire would make an example of, which is one of the times when they actually kill imperial officials, right? Like that's every once in a while. And that's something that, like every once in a while, just to show that the empire is just, an imperial official gets executed, right? And that's of tremendous propaganda value to show that you can be like, even amidst the colonized, if a British officer really violates the rules, they'll be executed. So I don't think Feeney makes it out. Not Feeney. I don't think Hannah makes it out of Ireland. I think he goes after. Plus, Pope is badly wounded.
Pope's about to die anyway. Like he's
been shot. And I mean, like, I'm not sure why he would go to. Feeney tells him like, go to America, escape. But I'm not sure that it would be quite that. I mean, maybe he could. I guess maybe you could disappear into the. But my sense is that, knowing the very little that we know of the character, really, in the course of the movie, that he follows Pope and maybe also like carries on like Feeney's sort of vendetta against all of the instruments of British rule in Ireland until he's caught, just like Feeney was. And like ultimately he is going to, like Feeney, like fight for his mates instead of for the Queen. Right. And he's going to like revenge all of these. He's going to like revenge his comrade, his like Irish comrades in this mixed British unit that he fought in, by carrying out the rest of Feeney's mission of like revenge in Ireland. That was my take on it anyway. Yeah.
I felt similar. It's like, I want to believe that he's going to go to America and have a happy life, but I just don't see that he's a happy guy. I just feel like at this point in time, he's going to finish the job. Right.
Yeah. I think he's going to, and Pope is such a classic evil Brit. You know what I mean? Like he plays, I guess that's Freddie Fox is the actor who plays him. And he's like, it's this kind of like fresh faced fanatic, right? Mm-hmm. Who's just like, he really believes in the, I like, you don't have to give sympathy for the devil, but I would have liked, I think there's a more complicated and tortured British mentality among these officers than just like the kind of like casual cruelty of it is Jim Broadbent of Jim Broadbent's character, or the kind of like homicidal monomania of Captain Pope. I just feel like this is not a very sophisticated account of guilt and responsibility in British imperial history. Not that it has to be, obviously, but you would think that, you could imagine a story told about the Irish famine in film that, for example, you could tell the story of something that happened during the Irish famine, which is the 1848 Irish Rebellion, which was the Young Ireland Rebellion, which is also quite funny because there's a young Irelander who's being interrogated at the beginning of the movie, and Hannah kills him in the midst of the interrogation. He strangles him. But Young Ireland was not like a proscribed political movement yet. And Young Ireland was not like a revolutionary party, and it didn't become one. And the leaders of Young Ireland were in Parliament, like they were MPs. They were not, like, it was not illegal to be a member of Young Ireland in 1847. So that story would be a much more kind of tragic famine story, because you could tell it kind of like in a Bravehearty sort of way, like Black 47 does, because the leaders of Young Ireland were these sort of like educated, like I describe them as kind of like Catholic atheists, in the sense that they were not like culturally and religiously Catholic, but were definitely more in the line of like continental liberal Republican constitutionalists in the model of the many revolutionary leaders of the revolutions of 1848. And they were romantics. They were romantic both in their inclinations artistically, but also in their ideas about the peasantry, and they had this vision that if they could only like light the fuse, they would be able to raise the Irish poor around them. Right. And then in the course of 1848, as the kind of a wave of political violence in Ireland, concomitant with the end of Black 47, and actually with the recovery a little bit of the country. Like it was only when when food started to be a little bit more food, that the revenge for the famine started to happen. And there were a lot more political assassinations and arsons and a general uptick in all kinds of crime. And so Britain kind of turned up the heat, and then eventually proscribed a series of, like, there were all these kind of Republican and nationalist newspapers that were closed down. And then eventually the Young Ireland Party kind of declared rebellion and tried to march on and like ended up in this. Then they had this one kind of tragic skirmish where it became, at first everybody thought that the Ireland had fallen and that like there had been like the revolution had been successful, but it hadn't been successful. There was this skirmish outside of a cottage, basically, where there were a bunch of police holed up inside of a cottage, taking shots at a very small number, like a few hundred, maybe a few thousand, depending who you ask, people outside with very few firearms. And then the Young Irelanders were going to set fire to the cottage. And then as soon as it seemed they were going to set fire to the cottage with the police officers inside, the police officers shot one person in the crowd, and then the whole crowd dispersed. And that was the end of the Young Ireland Rebellion. And then its leaders were, there's something tragic there about like the faith that the leaders had in the possibility of revolution at that moment, the confidence they had in their own kind of romantic idea of how the poor ought to respond to their ideas. But tellingly, none of them were executed, right? These were people who literally began an insurrection against the British Empire and were treasonous because some of them were members of Parliament. Like Smith O'Brien. And Smith O'Brien was exiled. He went to Van Diemen's Land, just like Feeney's brother. But he was, or not like Feeney's brother, like the guy in the courtroom scene. Feeney's brother's hanged. But he was like celebrated as a hero by the huge Irish diaspora in Van Diemen's Land, which was at that time was moving away from being a penal colony in any case. And then he went back to England and he was pardoned, and so these like the Young Irelanders eventually did not have they weren't killed by firing squad. They all wrote memoirs. Their memoirs are fascinating. And some of them, like one of them, a man named Thomas Mahar, ended up being an officer in the Union Army in the United States. Yeah. And another one of his, I forget the guy's name now, though I wrote about him a million times. Another one of his compatriots in Young Ireland ended up being a major propagandist for the Confederacy. So in some ways, like the battles of Irish nationalism were transported, like continued in Ireland, but there was this whole new dimension of the struggle against Britain that emerged with the all of the people who went abroad after the famine. And so I think this movie tries to like compress a lot of nationalist talking points into a very short stretch of time, while also like keeping the action going with a lot of gunplay. And I'm not sure it succeeds. It succeeds at the former, although some of the, as I said earlier, like some of the action sequences are pretty good.
All right. Well, I think that maybe brings us to our best and final question here. Is Black 47 a history movie?
I don't know. I guess what's a history movie?
That is on you, my friend. That is on you.
I would say it is a action movie set in an historical setting. I think if you were somebody who didn't know anything about the Irish famine, it would give you in bits and pieces some sense of what had happened. And that sense of what had happened would not be like, it's not exactly like historian stamp of approval, entirely accurate, but it certainly is. It's pretty like most, like there's nothing that's howlingly wrong about the movie. It just kind of compresses and plays with time and tries to smush together into 1-2 month period all things that did happen in the course of the famine, like the panic over superism, right? The panic over Protestant evangelism of Catholics. That happened, but it was pretty localized, and it's not clear whether, and it also happened after the responsibility for famine relief had been shifted to Irish poor laws, the Irish poor law unions. So it was later, it was like a couple of years later when the most kind of flagrant examples of superism happened. And they certainly wouldn't have been, like, it's a very unkind portrayal of British evangelicals, you know what I mean? Who probably would have spoken Irish, because that was one of the features of the event, like one of the most kind of characteristic features of the British missionary movement was proselytizing in the language of the ostensible converts. So the idea they're just like, we speak in English. English is God's language. You like grubby, you know what I mean? Like that missionary would probably, that language, he probably, I mean, and if he didn't know Irish, he would have had an interpreter, right? The idea that you would not try to offer that process. So like it compresses a lot. It like flattens out a lot of the texture of British history and compresses a lot of events, but it does like capture the like, it's definitely not, I would not say that the Irish like tourist board would necessarily like endorse the movie. Like sometimes you see, you know, like Better Call Saul. It's just like, what a beauty. You're like, let's go. I want to move to Albuquerque. Look how beautiful, even though these like, or in Breaking Bad, all these like horrible things are happening in this unbelievably beautiful countryside. It doesn't, yeah, I would say it's an action movie set in an historical era in the same way that I think you said it best, right? It's more like a Western. Like the Western doesn't really tell you about the history of Western expansion in the United States. Just kind of plops you into the setting, and there's all these kind of cliched tropes that everyone hits, and I think that kind of happens here. But I'd be, you know, I'm surprised that there hasn't been anything else. There aren't really that many novels even set during the famine. There were some written in the 19th century, but it's just, and I guess that's, you know, I think there's something about famine that is so, like, it's such a, like, it's so degrading and humiliating, and like the violence of it is so slow, you know, that it's hard to find kind of like it doesn't lend itself necessarily to fictional portrayals, because the things that are terrible about it are terrible in such an awful everyday way, you know? And like most people didn't die at the hands of British hanging judges. Most people died of typhus, you know? And that doesn't really
lend itself well to cinema.
Yeah, exactly. Or to literature, really, like, you know, and, you know, I've read there were famine novels written in the 19th century, like William Carleton's The Black Prophet, which I read about a little bit in Rot, but, you know, it's not, to the point where there's a, you know, like, Flann O'Brien has this parody, novella called the Poor Mouth, which kind of makes fun of the Irish tradition of incredibly melodramatic stories of poverty, right? Like to the point where, like in the Poor Mouth, which I read in translation, it's like in this Irish county where it rains, it never stops raining. Like it's always raining, and it's like, it really captures that sort of uphill both ways element of Irish storytelling, at least. And I think that can sometimes mask the fact that a lot of those, that really catastrophic grinding poverty was real in the famine. It was real before, and it was real after it too, because the famine was not a turning point in Irish political economy. Like people still ate potatoes afterward. They still had to compete for rent afterward. There were just fewer people, and they kept leaving. And the conflict with Ireland, the conflict with Britain, only got more complicated, in part because one of the consequences of the Irish famine was the reassertion of by the Catholic Church of like control over Irish Catholics, right? Like in a way, like a lot of the closer association of the Catholic Church with Irish nationalism. Which wasn't the case before, although the Brits thought it was. Like the Brits didn't like the Catholic Church in Ireland, not because they thought the Catholics were pro-independence. They thought that the Catholics were a fifth column who would like sell Ireland out to the Spanish or something, or the French, right? Like it wasn't anti-Catholicism because of any particular. It was because Catholicism was seen not as like nationalistic, but as opposed to, like in league with foreign powers rather than independently dangerous. Yeah.
Padraic, this has been, dude, first of all, I love the book.
Thank you so much.
And I have, and unlike you, sir, I have a copy. So there's that.
Yeah.
I love talking about this with you, man, because I felt like this is such, at least, again, I feel like there's such a diverse population of folks here in North America, the U.S., Canada, who have Irish ties. This continues to be important, and it's just not fundamentally well understood. And I feel like we're doing the work today, pal. So thank you so very much for being here, man. This was awesome.
Oh, I just wanted to draw attention to one more trope in the movie that in my notes. I was like, there's also a kind of Point Break moment, where he could shoot him, but he's like, I can't shoot him. He shoots in the air.
Yeah.
Anyway,
That's Hannah.
Anyway, yeah.
That's actually what happens to Hannah. He gets on a boat, but instead of going to the U.S., he actually goes to Australia to go for the 100-year storm down in Australia.
Yeah, he could be like a bushranger. Anyway, yeah. Thank you so much for the invitation. Buddy, this is really fun.
This is awesome. And that's a wrap here at Historians at the Movies podcast. Thank you so much to our guest, Padraic Scanlan, for coming in and talking about this film and his brand new book, Rot, an Imperial History of the Irish Famine. Thank you, of course, to our Irish-American producer, Fletcher Powell, for being here and producing this podcast. Fletcher knew I was going to have to bring this up at some point in time. So thank you so much, Fletcher, for being here. And thank you, of course, to all of you for continuing to support the podcast as well. If you want to help support the pod, you can do so by going to patreon.com/historiansofthemovies, or you can email me at historiansofthemovies@gmail.com and see about sponsoring the show. So we got a whole lot of great new pods coming for you shortly. There are a whole bunch in the tank, and we're even recording a whole bunch in the next few weeks. So keep being here, keep sharing the pod, and thanks for being here. Ciao for now.